At 12 minutes past 1 on a Thursday afternoon, Arthur Bennett fell asleep sitting up. He was on the low wooden bench outside the science corridor, the one nobody ever used, with his cleaning cart parked beside him and a mop handle leaning against his knee. His head had tipped back until it rested against the wall. His hands stayed folded in his lap, the way a man sits when he only means to close his eyes for a moment. The corridor was empty. Lunch had pulled all the noise to the far end of the building. A woman came up the stairs from the front office. A parent, there about a permission form. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at the mop bucket. She looked at the man asleep beside it. She took out her phone. Click. Arthur didn't move. Mr. Bennett. He opened his eyes. Principal Helen Morris stood at the end of the corridor with a folder against her chest. The parent was already walking past her, already looking at her screen, already deciding what to write underneath the picture. Arthur sat up and reached for the mop handle out of habit. And from the look on Helen's face, he understood that something had gone wrong, that it would be difficult to explain, and that he probably wouldn't try. To understand why he was that tired, you have to go back 4 days. Arthur had worked at Franklin Ridge Elementary for 9 years. Before that, he had spent 26 years repairing machinery at a bottling plant that no longer existed, and before that he had been a boy who took clocks apart and got in trouble for it. He was 61. He wore the same grey work shirt every day, washed and pressed, and a flat pencil behind his ear that he never seemed to use. He knew things about that school nobody had written down. He knew which boy forgot his lunchbox on the bus twice a month, and he kept a paper bag of crackers in his cart for exactly that reason, and never once said out loud who it was for. On Monday he knelt in the hallway and tightened the wheel on a girl's backpack while she stood there, embarrassed to be the only child with a bag that rattled. "There," he said, "now it's quiet." She ran off without saying thank you. He didn't seem to expect it. That was the week Maya Collins started standing near his door. Maya was 10, small for her age, and quick in a way that didn't show up on paper. Her problem was instructions. When a worksheet gave her 5 steps in a row, the words piled up in front of her like furniture in a hallway. In 2nd grade she had read a science instruction out loud and gotten it wrong, and a boy had laughed, and the sound of it stayed with her longer than the mistake. Since then she didn't raise her hand. She ate lunch on the low wall outside the maintenance corridor, where nobody looked for her, 3 feet from Arthur Bennett's open door. The science showcase was in 2 weeks. Maya had chosen a windmill, a wooden tower with 4 paper blades, and a battery motor meant to spin them. Her teacher had been clear. The projects were to be completed by the students themselves. The motor did not turn. Maya had been holding the thing on her lap for 4 days. "Is it broken?" Arthur asked, without looking up from the door hinge he was oiling. "It doesn't work." "Those are 2 different things." Maya looked at him. He set down the oil can, wiped his hands, and held out one palm. She gave him the windmill. He turned it over once, and then did something that surprised her. He gave it back. "What happens," he said, "if we find where the electricity stops?" Maya stared at the wires. "I don't know." "Good." Arthur picked up the oil can again. "That's where fixing things starts." She didn't understand it that day. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. He never told her she was clever. He never told her she was special. He simply stopped handing her 5 things at once. He would say, "Touch the wire." Then he would wait. Then, "Now the other end." Then he would wait again, and let her be the one who said the next part out loud. By Wednesday she had gotten the motor to twitch, half a turn, then nothing, and she made a small sound she immediately covered with her hand, because she wasn't used to making sounds like that in a school building. Before we go on, if stories about ordinary people and the moments that change their lives mean something to you, take a second to subscribe to Written Destiny, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, back to the school. There was a locker at the back of the maintenance room. Grey, dented at the corner, older than the shelving around it. He kept it closed. "What's in there?" Maya asked. Arthur looked at it a moment longer than the question needed. "Things I haven't figured out how to fix yet." She assumed he meant broken objects. That afternoon, Helen Morris stopped him in the office corridor. It was the second conversation of its kind in a month. You looked exhausted at the assembly. Just getting old. Arthur. She said it kindly, but she said it. You work around ladders and electrical panels, and a boiler I don't trust. If you're that tired, it stops being a personal matter and starts being a safety matter. He nodded and said he'd take it easy. She believed him because he had never given her a reason not to. Wednesday night it rained hard enough to fill the gutters and overrun them. At 11 minutes past midnight, a seam let go in a pipe above the library, and water began coming through the ceiling tiles onto the non-fiction shelves. Arthur was in the building because the alarm panel had thrown a fault, and he'd come back to reset it. He stood in the doorway and watched the stain spread. Then he moved. Buckets, plastic sheeting, books stacked in the reading corner under a tarp, the emergency contractor's line ringing out to an answering service that promised somebody in the morning. Morning was going to be too late for 400 books. He got the ladder. That's all we'll say about that night for now. Thursday, 1:12 in the afternoon, a woman took a photograph in an empty corridor. By Thursday evening, it had been shared into a parent group with a caption using the words, "Our taxes," and "Asleep on the job." By Friday morning, it had reached the district office, and the district office had reached Helen Morris. The meeting was at 10. Mr. Caldwell was already in the office. He was 39, ran operations for 4 schools, and was not a cruel man, but he had spent 2 years trying to get the boiler replaced and the incident forms filled out, and he had an inspection in 11 days. "Mr. Bennett," Helen said, "were you asleep in the science corridor on Thursday afternoon?" Arthur had a defense. It was sitting in the security footage, time-stamped, 400 books deep. He could have said it in one sentence. "Yes," he said. Helen waited. "During your shift?" "Yes." Caldwell put both hands flat on the table. "We've had this conversation twice. Fatigue around equipment. You told the principal you'd manage it." "I did. And," Arthur looked at the table, "and I fell asleep." That was the whole of it. He offered nothing else, and seemed almost relieved to be finished talking. Helen waited for him to give her something. A reason, an excuse, anything she could carry back to the district and stand behind. He didn't. She had a photograph, a documented warning, an inspection coming, and an employee who agreed with every word of the accusation. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she said. Caldwell recommended termination. Helen agreed to it. She would think about that meeting for a long time afterward, not because she had been unfair, but because she had been fair to the only part of the story she had bothered to collect. Arthur cleaned out a drawer. That was all it took. A thermos, reading glasses, a photograph of his wife Ellen from a birthday nobody else remembered. He left the locker alone. Half of what was in it wasn't his. He was carrying the box past the science corridor when he heard running feet. "Mr. Bennett?" Maya stopped in front of him, out of breath, and looked at the box and understood something without being told. "What about my windmill?" Arthur stood very still. Of all the things he had failed to finish that week, that was the one that reached him. "It's in my locker," he said. 12, 24, 6. Ask Mrs. Alvarez to walk down with you." Maya repeated the numbers under her breath. He shifted the box under one arm and looked at her the way you look at somebody when you already know. You won't get another chance to say it. "Maya, don't let somebody else fix it for you." Then he walked out through the front doors, past the bench, into an ordinary Friday. She watched the doors swing shut. The next afternoon, Maya went down to the maintenance room with Mrs. Alvarez, who waited in the hall and checked her phone. The locker opened on the second try. The windmill was on the middle shelf, exactly where he'd said, the paper blades slightly bent. Maya lifted it out. Underneath was a cheap spiral notebook, curled at the corner, the kind they sold 4 for $1 at the drugstore on Warren Street. Written across the cover in blocky pencil letters was a name, Maya Collins. She didn't open it in the hallway. She waited until Mrs. Alvarez had gone back upstairs, then sat down on the cold floor with her back against the shelving and opened the cover. The first line was near the top of the page, in the same blocky pencil. Maya doesn't like being watched when she gets an answer wrong. She stopped reading. She looked at the door, and then at the wall, and then she read it again. She turned the page. Give her one instruction at a time. Then, further down, in different pencil, from some other day. She understands circuits better than she thinks. There were maybe 15 lines in the whole notebook, written over months. One said, "Don't say easy, say we'll see." One, near the end, was 3 words long. She isn't slow. Maya sat on that floor a long time. She had spent 2 years believing nobody noticed anything about her except the wrong answers. And here was a man with a mop cart who had been keeping track, in pencil, of how to talk to her. She looked up. There were other notebooks in the locker. Not hundreds, maybe 12, stacked on their sides at the back of the shelf, each with a first name on the cover. Theo, Nina, Marcus, Devon, Grace. Beside them, in a shoebox, a collection of broken things. A toy car with 1 axle, cracked headphones, a music box with the lid off, a lunchbox clasp bent flat, the kind of thing an adult throws away and a child carries in a pocket for a week. Maya put the shoebox back. She should have put the notebook back too. She took it home. Rachel Collins found her daughter reading it at the kitchen table on Sunday morning. Rachel was 34, worked 2 shifts that overlapped badly, and had spent a year trying to find a tutor she could afford for a child whose report card said, capable but disengaged. She read 3 lines over Maya's shoulder and felt something cold go down her back. "Where did you get this?" "Mr. Bennett's locker." "Maya." Rachel took the notebook, turned it over, turned it back. "Why does the janitor have a notebook with your name on it?" "He was helping me." "Helping you with what?" Maya said everything, which was true, and which sounded to a frightened mother at 8 in the morning like nothing at all. On Monday, Rachel was at the school office before the first bell. She put the notebook on Helen Morris's desk. "I want to know what this is." Helen read it standing up. Then she sat down and read it again. And here is the honest part. She did not immediately see a good man. She saw an employee who had kept written records about children, in private, in a locked locker, without telling anyone. She saw a phone call she would have to make. "Give me 2 days," she said. She did not call the district that morning. She started asking questions instead. She began with the teachers, because nobody had thought to ask them anything yet. Mrs. Alvarez remembered a boy who could not grasp fractions no matter how many pizzas she drew on the board, and who came in one Monday and explained halves and quarters using the floor tiles in the corridor. Because, he said, the janitor had walked him along them, counting out loud. The 4th grade teacher remembered Arthur kneeling in the cafeteria over the broken tray arm of a girl's wheelchair, refusing to let her leave until she'd worked the latch herself. Nobody had thought any of it worth mentioning. That was what stayed with Helen. It had been sitting there for 9 years, in plain view, unremarkable, the way ordinary decency usually is. On the 2nd day, a young man came in to sign out his little brother early for a dentist appointment. He was 19, in a delivery company polo shirt. He glanced at the notebook stacked on the corner of Helen's desk and stopped walking. "He had one for me too," he said. Helen looked up. "You knew about these?" "He showed me mine. 6th grade. The young man laughed, quietly, at something a long way behind him. "I asked him if I could keep it. He said no, because he wasn't finished." Helen said, "What did he teach you?" The young man thought about it. "Mostly," he said, "that I wasn't stupid." He signed the form and took his brother out to the car. Then she pulled the security footage, because there was one question she had never asked, and it had begun to bother her at night. Why had a 61-year-old man been so tired he fell asleep sitting upright in an empty corridor? The maintenance log for Wednesday night was blank. Arthur had filed nothing. The cameras hadn't. 12:11 a.m. Arthur entering the library, carrying buckets. 1:34 a.m. Arthur on a ladder, half out of frame, a ceiling panel under one arm. 2:48 a.m. Arthur on his knees, moving books 3 at a time. 3:09 a.m. Arthur locking the front doors behind him. 6:27 a.m. Arthur unlocking them again. Helen watched it twice. Caldwell watched it once, standing behind her chair with his arms folded. When it finished, he said, he still slept during his shift. And he was right. That was the difficult thing. He was completely right. Yes, Helen said. She didn't look away from the screen. But now I need to know why a 61-year-old employee thought staying here until 3 in the morning was easier than asking us for help. Caldwell didn't answer. She said, because I think we taught him that. Arthur, that week, was at home. It was a small house on Warren Street, with a garage he'd never once parked a car in. He was not destitute. He had savings, a paid-off roof, a pension 4 years out. What he did not have was a reason to get up. His alarm didn't ring on Monday. He woke at 5:10 anyway, and lay there listening to the furnace, and then got up because lying there was worse. He made coffee and drank it standing at the counter. No keys on his belt, no radio. Nobody knocking on a workshop door at 11 to say the tap in room 9 was doing the thing again. He filled out 4 applications that week. One called him in. A polite young man in a good shirt looked at 35 years of work history and asked, gently, whether the physical demands might be a lot at this stage. Arthur said he understood. He did. That was the worst part. At school, the science showcase was 6 days out. Maya's windmill sat on her bedroom floor, with its blades bent and its motor silent. On Wednesday, her teacher offered to take it home and look at the wiring. Maya said no. The teacher offered again, gently, the way adults do when they think a child hasn't understood. Mr. Bennett said not to let somebody else fix it, Maya said. That evening she took the notebook out of her bag and looked for the answer. Arthur hadn't written one. No diagram, no instruction, nothing about motors at all. Only a line near the middle of a page from some afternoon months earlier. Ask where the electricity stops. Maya put the notebook down. She got a battery and touched the wire to it. The motor turned, so it wasn't the motor. It took her 2 hours, and she talked to herself the entire time. At 9:20, the blades went around. She didn't tell anyone. She sat on her bedroom floor and watched them spin until the battery began to fade, then turned it off to save it for Saturday. Helen Morris drove to Warren Street on Thursday afternoon. Arthur answered the door in a work shirt with nothing to do in it. They sat in a front room with a photograph of a woman on the shelf and a clock on the wall that ran 3 minutes fast. I've seen the footage from Wednesday night, Helen said. I want to apologize, not for the decision, for making it before I had the whole thing in front of me. That was mine, and it was wrong. Arthur was quiet for a moment. You didn't fire me for something I didn't do, he said. Arthur, I was asleep. He said it plainly, without flinching. You had a photograph of it, and it was true. That's not your mistake. Helen felt that land somewhere she wasn't ready for. Why didn't you tell anyone about the library? Arthur thought about it. Because the pipe didn't care whose job it was, he said. And because you'd have had to pay me 8 hours you didn't have. I've seen the budget notices in the staff room, same as everyone. Helen took the notebooks out of her bag and set them on the table. Arthur looked at them, and something in his face closed. Those are just so I don't forget. A boy tells you something in October, and it's March, and you've forgotten how he likes it explained, and you've wasted his time. That's all that is. You have 12 of them. I've been there 9 years. Helen said, did you ever think about doing this properly? Working with students, on purpose? Arthur laughed, not bitterly, just at the shape of the idea. I'm a janitor. I know what your job was, Helen said. I'm asking what you're good at. Arthur didn't answer. He looked at the clock that ran 3 minutes fast and said nothing at all. Saturday morning, the gymnasium, 41 folding tables, 3 judges, 110 parents in coats. Maya stood behind her windmill in a green sweater with her hands behind her back. Arthur was not there. Nobody had thought to tell him. The judge with the clipboard read her card, asked 2 questions she answered quietly and correctly, and reached down for the switch. Click. The blades did not move. The judge waited. Somebody's chair scraped. Rachel, 4 rows back, felt her whole body go tight. Maya looked at the still blades. And then, in front of 110 people, she knelt down on the gymnasium floor beside her project. She did not cry, and she did not look at her mother, and she did not ask for help. She put her thumb on the battery pack and worked forward along the wire, the way she had 2 nights earlier on her bedroom floor. Battery. Fine. First joint. Fine. Second joint. A copper thread lying loose against the plastic, shaken free somewhere between a bedroom and a gymnasium. Maya pressed it back into the terminal and held it there with her thumbnail. "Can you try it again?" she said. The judge flipped the switch. The blades turned. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of room. Her teacher smiled and wrote something down. Rachel put her hand over her mouth and left it there. Maya stood up, brushed off her knees, and explained in short, ordinary sentences how she had found the break. The judge asked how long that had taken her to learn. Maya said about 2 weeks. Then she looked toward the gymnasium doors, at the place near the frame where a man in a grey work shirt usually stood with his arms folded during assemblies. The doorway was empty. She turned back to her windmill. She didn't win first prize. First prize went to a very good solar oven, built by a boy with an engineer for a father. Maya received a commendation for problem solving, a small certificate, for diagnosing and repairing a fault under pressure and explaining the process. Rachel framed it. Maya didn't ask her to, but the certificate wasn't the thing. The thing was that on Monday, in class, Maya raised her hand for the first time since 2nd grade and got the answer wrong, and nothing happened, and the world did not end, and she raised it again on Wednesday. That was the actual prize. It just didn't fit in a frame. Helen Morris spent the following week on the telephone. There was money in the district, not much. Attached to a hands-on learning initiative nobody had staffed properly. A practical learning room, part-time support, working alongside a qualified teacher. She drove back to Warren Street on a Tuesday and laid it out plainly, because she'd learned Arthur didn't respond to anything else. Reinstatement, if he wanted it. Back pay for 8.5 hours of emergency work, plus overtime, which the district had disputed for 6 days and then paid, and 10 hours a week in the practical learning room, showing children how to take things apart. Arthur listened to all of it. Then he said, "No. I appreciate it," he said. "But people feel sorry for me now, and I've watched what happens to a man who takes a job made out of sympathy. In 2 years there's a budget meeting, everyone's uncomfortable, and nobody says why. This isn't pity, Arthur. It looks like it from here." Helen put the notebooks on the table again. It didn't work the second time either. And then somebody knocked on the front door. Maya was standing on the step in her green sweater, holding the windmill, with Rachel behind her at the bottom of the path. "It broke again," Maya said. Arthur was out of his chair before he'd decided to be. 35 years of reaching for broken things. His hands were already halfway out. Maya pulled it back against her chest. "I fixed it," she said. Arthur stopped. She turned it around and showed him the terminal and the thumbnail-sized bend she'd put in the copper so it would stay seated, and she explained the whole thing in about 40 seconds without once looking at him for permission. Arthur listened to the end. Then he sat down slowly on the arm of the chair, and it was a while before he said anything. He had spent 9 years believing that what he gave those children was repairs, working motors, fixed clasps, doors that didn't drag. "It had never been," Maya said. "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes." "Who's going to show the next kid?" Arthur looked at the floor of his front room for a long moment. Then he said, "What days did you say?" And Helen said, "Mondays and Thursdays." Caldwell did not become a villain, and nothing happened to him. What happened instead was a memo, 4 points long, that Helen wrote and the district adopted in March. Emergency call-outs logged the same night, by anyone. Anyone working past midnight rest restricted the next day, without loss of pay. A documented check-in each term for every support employee. And no disciplinary termination until the circumstances have been investigated, in writing, by a second party. Caldwell read it and signed it. He said to Helen on the way out that he had looked at the incident and never once at the week around it, and that he wasn't sure a supervisor was supposed to know the difference, but that he'd like to. He and Arthur never became friends. They nodded in corridors. Once, in November, Caldwell found a boiler fault at 7 in the morning and called Arthur before he called anyone else, and Arthur understood exactly what that meant. Arthur came back on the second Monday in April. He walked in through the front doors at 10 to 7, the same as always, with the same thermos and the same flat pencil behind his ear. The science corridor was empty at that hour. He stopped beside the low wooden bench where a woman had once photographed him sleeping, and he stood there for a moment and looked at it. Then he picked up a paper cup somebody had left underneath it and went to work. At the end of the east wing, a storage room that had held broken chairs for 11 years now had a small plastic sign beside the door. Practical Learning Workshop. That was all it said. No name on it. Arthur had been very clear about that. Inside were 2 long tables, a pegboard, donated radios, 4 alarm clocks, a bin of small motors, and a laminated sheet of safety rules Arthur made the children read out loud. He still wore his grey work shirt. He still ran a mop through the gym on Wednesdays. Nobody called him anything except Mr. Bennett. He hadn't turned into somebody else. He had just been allowed, at 61, to do the thing he'd been doing anyway. Several months later, in September, Maya Collins came down the East Wing corridor after last bell. She was 11 now, and in the 6th grade across the field, and she came back on Thursdays because Arthur had never once told her she was too old for it. The old grey locker was still in the corner of the workshop, dented at the same corner. The notebooks weren't in it anymore. Helen had sat down with Arthur in May and explained student privacy procedures, and he had listened and nodded and moved every one of them into a locked cabinet in the staff room, where he signed them out like anybody else. He hadn't minded. He said it was probably how it should have been all along. The locker held something else now. Maya opened it. Inside was a desk lamp with a cracked base and a frayed cord, and a yellow sticky note stuck to the shade in blocky pencil letters. "Don't fix this for me." Behind her, Arthur set down a box of screwdrivers. Maya lifted the lamp out and turned it over in both hands, the way she'd seen him do 100 times. "Where do I start?" she said. Arthur looked at the lamp. Then he looked at her. "Where does the electricity stop?" Maya grinned. "Good. That's where fixing things starts." But Arthur shook his head. "No." She looked up, confused. He nodded toward the lamp in her hands. "You tell me." Maya sat down at the long table and pulled the lamp toward her and began. Arthur stepped back. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Written Destiny and tell us in the comments about the person nobody noticed who noticed you.